These are our first set of notes on percent of a number and percents in general. So before we start talking about how to find percent of a number, we need to make sure we know what a percent means. So a percent is a special ratio, and it's a ratio that is always written and representing something out of 100. Now that's something that the word percent actually can help us remember that. If you break the word into word parts, you see that you have per, which means for, and cent, which is a part that means 100. And I remember that by thinking about how many cents there are in a dollar. So a percent is a ratio that's always representing something out of 100. So how do we find percent of a number? That's a very common problem. We do a lot of this in real life. Well, there's two basic steps. You're going to change the percent into something that you can use for calculating. So that's going to be either into the form of a fraction, or you're going to change it to a decimal. Now you're not really changing the percent, you're just rewriting in a different format. And you can use both fractions and decimals, are both different ways that you can write also percents. So you change the percent into its fraction form or its decimal form, and then you multiply it by the number that you want to find the percent of. So in both cases, we're going to multiply basically the percent times the number, but we have to change that percent into either its fraction or its decimal form. Now, if you don't remember how to change a percent into a fraction or a decimal, let's do a quick review of that. To change a percent into a fraction, we just remember what percent means. It means per 100. So for example, 43% just means 43 out of 100. There's your fraction. The last thing you would want to do with a situation of changing a percent to a fraction is check to see if it can be simplified. 43 out of 100 is in its simplest form. There are other percents that we might change into a fraction, like say 25%, that when you change that into 25 over 100, that is not a simplest form fraction, so we would need to simplify that. There's lots of different ways you can do that. The fastest way is to divide them both by the biggest number that can go into them, and that would be 25 in this case, giving us a simplest form of 1/4. Even percents that are not just a 2-digit percent can be changed into fractions. So for example, 140%. I can turn that into a fraction form, again remembering that it's 140 out of 100, and now I simplify. In this case, I can divide both of these by 10 as a quick start to my simplifying. When I do that, I get 14 over 10, and now it's even more obvious to me, oh wait, this is actually also an improper fraction. So 14 over 10, 10 goes into 14 one whole time. There's 4 towards the next group of 10, and now I can see, oh whoops, I did not get that in simplest form all the way. So now I need to divide again by 2, and I end up with 1 2/5. So 140% could be written in what we would call fraction form as 1 2/5. What about changing a percent into a decimal? Well, again, we remember what percent means. It means per 100. So this is 43 per 100. Well, remember that fraction bars are another way of saying divide. So to change a percent to a decimal, we just take the percent amount and divide by 100. And when you do that, and you can use your calculator to do that, you get 0.43 in this case. To do our other examples, 25% would be 25 divided by 100, and as a decimal that's going to come out 0.25. 140%, if we do 140 divided by 100, we're not going to get 1.4, we are going to get 1.4, and that would be the decimal form, even though it also has a whole number. That's okay. One last thought about changing from the percent to a decimal. Sometimes you have percents that are already having a decimal amount in them. Like for example, 4.6%. That's not the decimal form. It just happens to be a percent that includes a decimal point already shown in there. We still would take 4.6 and divide by 100. So the decimal form would be 0.046. And sometimes you have percents, like say 300%, that when we divide it by 100, we get something like 3, which doesn't look to some folks like a decimal value because there's not a decimal that we can see, but it is the decimal value. You just don't see that the decimal point is actually right here. So now let's try a couple of examples. Try these on your own using the Edpuzzle problem and recording your answer before watching how we work them out. All right, so for what is 57% of 843? We need to figure out 57% of 843, so we're going to do 57% times 843. And we can do this either by changing 57% into a fraction or by changing it into a decimal. So let's just do both. 57% as a fraction would be 57 over 100, and that's in its simplest form, times 843. Now when I do that on my calculator, I would get 480 and 51 hundredths. Not the prettiest number, but it would work, and it's in simplest form. If I do it the other method, where I change it into a decimal, I'm going to have 0.57 times 843. I'm still going to get the 480, but now the leftover part is going to be in the form of the decimal 0.51. Either way works. Some people find this to be a little easier to work with in its final form, but it really doesn't matter. A lot of times it depends on what the percentage is, which way feels like a simpler type of math to work with. Same idea now with the second one, 132% of 12. Try it on your own before you watch the video. All right, so now let's see how this one works out. So again, the same idea. We're going to do 132% times 12. I can change it into a fraction. So that would be 1 and 32 hundredths times 12. That's not in its simplest form though. So if I change that to its simplest fraction form, that would be 1 and 8/25 times 12. And when I do that, as I work that out, I end up then with my answer being 15 and 21/25. Again, not the simplest, most streamlined fraction, but it still would be okay. If I want to instead use the decimal form, I would change 132% to 1.32, and I would multiply that times 12. And I'm going to get an answer that's equivalent, but instead of being in its fraction form, that leftover part is going to be its decimal form of 15.84. All right, so those are some kind of straightforward examples. Now let's look at a couple of real life ones. Again, pause the video before you look at how to solve this and try it on your own. Okay, so we're looking at Jonah buying a new coat. The new coat Jonah has been wanting is finally on sale for 30% off. If the original price of the coat was $85, how much will he save with the sale? So I've underlined 30% off and $85, and I've circled how much will he save. This is what we're looking for, how much he will save at 30% off of $85. So what we want to calculate is 30% of $85. So that's kind of the first step with any word problem, is just to kind of dig out what is it that we want to know. And we want to know how much he's going to save if it's 30% of 85. So that's what we want to calculate. Since it's money, I'm going to use the decimal form because that seems a little more like money. So 0.3 is the decimal form of 30% times $85. And when I do that, I'm going to get 25.5. And then I'm going to remember it's money. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that there's 2 decimal places by adding on that 0 at the end. And I'm going to put my dollar sign. And now I'm going to use my question and turn that around to write my answer. So how much will he save? He will save $25.50 on the coat. And there you go. All right. Now before you look at the work for this next one, pause the video and try it on your own. Okay, the marching band had a food drive last week. Their goal was to collect 200 items. They collected 125% of their goal. How many items did they collect? So again, we're going to go in here and we're going to identify what's our important information. Well, how many items did they collect is our question. So let's start with what are we looking for? We're looking for how many items they collected. Well, what do we know? We know that their goal was to collect 200 items. And they actually collected 125% of their goal. So look at those words, 125% of their goal. Well, what was their goal? Because what we want to find is 125% of the goal. Do we know what the goal is? Yes, back here. Their goal was to collect 200 items. So I'm just going to swap out those words, goal, their goal, with the number 200. And now I have my problem. The math that I need to do is now 125% of 200. So I'm going to take that and make that 1.25 times 200. Type that in my calculator, and I get 250. So now I take this with my question, I turn my question around, and I turn it into the start out of my answer. So how many items did they collect? They collected 250 items. There you go.